Jesus tells stories about seeds, farmers, weddings. But if you listen to the parables carefully, it can sound like he's not trying to make things easier to understand. And that has gotten a lot of people to ask a question, and that is, why teach this way? Why not just explain things directly and get to the point? Because at the end of the day, if the goal is clarity, why use stories that people can misunderstand? So here's the key to this, based on first century cultural settings and understanding. Parables don't function in just one way. Biblical scholars who have studied the parables of Jesus have said that the point of a parable is double-fold. It is to reveal and to conceal. So on the one hand, a parable can reveal or expose the truth of something, but it can also hide the truth. And it hides it in the sense that it requires interpretation. That's why when you hear a parable, if you're willing to engage, you feel drawn in. And if you don't engage, you're gonna be left with the surface, a superficial understanding of the intended meaning of the parable. In this way, the same parable can lead one person to insight and another person to miss the point entirely. My name is Elias. I was born and raised in Jerusalem. I'm a philosophy professor and a Bible scholar, and I help people frame the Bible in its proper cultural setting. Okay, so most people assume that parables are just simple illustrations, that they exist to make ideas easier. But in the Gospels, they often do something more demanding. They don't just present an idea. A parable invites the listener to a process. So here's something from philosophy that could be very useful for us. There are different ways of knowing something. You can be told a fact, that's the first way, or the second way, you can come to know that fact through first-hand experience. For example, somebody can tell you that fire is hot, or you can touch it, and so the experience of touching it will register differently than the mere fact of being told something. And that's what parables do. They lean more towards the experiential part. And by that I mean, they make you enter a situation. And once you enter that situation, you make a judgment, and then realize that the judgment may be about you. And so a parable makes you think through the information, and it makes you participate in the process that leads to reaching the conclusion. Take the well-known parable of the Good Samaritan. It doesn't just define what a neighbor is, it shows you what it means to become one. And it forces a question. Who actually counts as my neighbor? But just as importantly, you can ask, who am I choosing to be a neighbor to? You see, the story moves you from this general idea to a more personal evaluation. Also, take the parable of the sower. A farmer scatters seeds and they fall on different kinds of soil. And it's the same exact seed, but you get completely different outcomes. And then at the end of the parable, you feel like the story is turning that same question on you. Which kind of soil are you? Are you the shallow, the crowded, the hard, or the good? Because the difference isn't in the seed, the difference isn't in the message, it's how it's received. As I read the Bible, I can't help but think of Mark chapter 4. Jesus says something striking. He says, some people hear, but don't fully understand. Which is something that you also find in the book of Isaiah, where people hear, but they don't actually perceive. So the issue isn't about hearing the truth, it's about how this truth is received, processed, thought through, and then applied to one's life. Sometimes with us humans, when something is stated directly, we filter it almost immediately. We might even criticize it right away without letting the message of the parable or of that statement to sink in. But parables interrupts that entire process because they don't argue with you directly. You don't feel threatened by the parable so much. They give you that space where you can begin to navigate how best to understand that specific message. And that's what gets you to begin to see things from different angles and from different perspectives. And so a parable is never meant to be received passively. A parable gets you to work on the information you're given so that you can get to a place of earning the understanding that comes from that parable. And so sometimes the most important question to ask oneself about parables is not about what does this thing mean within the parable, but it's how are you responding to your own evaluation of that parable.